r/NoSleep. I inherited my uncle's cottage in the mountains, but he never told me the truth. When my uncle passed away, I inherited his small cottage nestled high in the mountains of British Columbia. It had been in the family for generations, a place where my uncle had spent most of his life, living alone and rarely having visitors. He never married, and when I was younger, I would visit him occasionally, but his cryptic, solitary nature always made me uncomfortable. He never spoke much about the cottage or the surrounding land, except for a few vague warnings about the area being untouched by man and not for the faint of heart. Upon his death, I thought it would be a perfect escape from the busy city life. I was tired of the noise, the people, and the constant rush. The cottage, although old and somewhat worn, seemed like the perfect place to reset my life. It sat on a plot of land surrounded by dense forest, with a winding mountain trail leading to a crystal-clear lake hidden deep within the woods. The air was crisp, the silence absolute, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. I was alone, as the nearest neighbor was miles away, and the isolation felt oddly comforting. But as the days passed, I began to notice strange things. The first night there, I heard what I assumed was an animal wandering around outside. The wind howled through the trees, but in between gusts, I could swear I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching the gravel of the driveway. I dismissed it, assuming it was just the sounds of nature. But then the second night came. I woke to the sound of knocking, soft and rhythmic. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but when I opened my eyes, I could hear it clearly. Someone, or something, was knocking at the front door. My heart raced. I hesitated, but finally mustered the courage to get up. The cottage was silent again, save for the wind. When I opened the door, no one was there. Just the dense forest and the full moon casting long shadows across the ground. Confused and uneasy, I checked the locks and bolted the door. The next day, I went into town to pick up supplies, and I happened to mention the strange knocking to an elderly shopkeeper. Her face went pale, and she told me to be careful. She said my uncle wasn't the first to live in that cottage, and it wasn't the first time someone had inherited the property. But every person who lived there, she said, eventually left, usually after something inexplicable happened. She said it wasn't the cottage that scared people, but the land itself. Don't go wandering the woods at night, she warned me. There are things in those trees that shouldn't be disturbed. Your uncle knew that. He kept to himself for a reason. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence of the woods seemed oppressive, like the trees themselves were waiting for something. I stayed close to the cottage, but the following day, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to explore the woods, just to see what my uncle had kept hidden all these years. As I ventured deeper, the trees grew denser, and the air colder. I walked for hours, the path winding and twisting, leading me further away from the cottage. Eventually, I came across an old stone marker half buried in the underbrush. It was inscribed with strange symbols I didn't recognize. It looked ancient, as though it had been there for centuries. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The same rhythmic knocking. It echoed through the forest, but now, it was louder, more urgent. I spun around, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing but shadows. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, and covered in ragged black clothing that seemed to blend into the shadows. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The figure moved closer, and in the dim light, I saw its face, a pale, hollow expression with dark, empty eyes staring directly at me. It spoke in a voice that sounded like the wind rustling through dead leaves. Leave. Leave before it's too late. I backed away, my breath shallow, and ran all the way back to the cottage. I bolted the door and spent the night in a cold sweat, hearing the knocking echoing again, this time louder, coming from every direction. The next morning, I found a letter from my uncle, tucked away in a drawer I hadn't noticed before. It was dated years ago, written in a hurried, trembling hand. The letter read, "To my last heir, beware. The land is cursed. The knocking you hear is not just from the trees, it is from the past. There is something old and vengeful in those woods. It cannot be bargained with or escaped. When night falls, it comes for the unwary. Do not linger, do not look back. And never, ever go to the lake." As I read those words, I heard it again, the knocking. This time, it wasn't just outside the door. It was coming from within the walls, from the floorboards, as if the house itself was alive. I knew then that I was not alone. The cottage wasn't just a place to rest. It was a prison, and I was the latest victim of its ancient curse. The knocking continues, growing louder with each passing night, and now, I can hear whispers in the woods, calling me. My uncle was right. I should have never come here. But now, it's too late. Days passed, and I became a prisoner of the cottage, trapped by the ever-present knocking and the voices from the woods. I could feel the eyes of the land on me, following my every movement, as though it were alive, watching, waiting for something. The knocking was relentless, always at night, always growing louder, until it seemed as though the very foundation of the cottage was shaking with the force of it. It was driving me to the brink of madness. The whispers in the woods had started to take shape. I could no longer ignore them. They were voices, faint but distinct, calling my name, beckoning me into the forest. The wind carried their words, weaving through the trees in an eerie, unintelligible chant. They spoke of a long-lost past, of a forgotten ritual, and of a terrible price paid by those who had come before me. One night, the knocking stopped altogether. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was over. I dared to hope that the curse had been lifted. But the silence was suffocating. I sat in the dark, listening, waiting for any sign that the curse was truly gone. Then, I heard it, the sound of a door creaking open, the faintest of footsteps moving through the house. The door to the attic. It was never open. My uncle had sealed it years ago, according to the letter, warning me not to explore it. But now, the door was ajar, and something inside beckoned me closer. I could no longer fight the pull. I grabbed a flashlight and ascended the narrow, creaking staircase to the attic, my heart pounding with fear and anticipation. As I reached the top, the flashlight flickered, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. I stepped into the attic, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the corner, was a large wooden chest. It had been there when my uncle lived here, but I had never seen it open. The lid was slightly ajar, revealing a faint, flickering light from within. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, as though the very walls of the house were holding their breath. I hesitated, but the curiosity gnawed at me. I opened the chest. Inside was a stack of old journals, yellowed with age. They were my uncle's writings. But there was more. At the very bottom of the chest, a large, cracked mirror, its surface dark and cloudy. The moment I touched the mirror, the whispers grew louder, the voices becoming clear. "You shouldn't have come," they said. "It's too late. You're the next one. The next to be claimed." Suddenly, I was not alone. The figure from the woods stood in the mirror, its hollow eyes staring directly at me. The knocking began again, louder than ever. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the mirror. The figure raised a hand, pointing at me, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to step closer. I turned to run, but the mirror's surface seemed to warp, pulling me in. I screamed, but the house was silent again. The knocking had stopped. There was no escape now. The house had claimed me. And like my uncle, I was now part of the land, a forgotten soul, waiting for the next to inherit the curse. The knocking would never stop. It would never stop calling for the next victim. The knocking would never stop. It would never stop calling for the next victim. The years passed in the cottage like a haze. Time itself seemed distorted within the walls of that cursed place. Each night, I could hear the knocking, growing louder and louder, reverberating through the house as if the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with dark intent. And each night, I would lie in my bed, frozen, unable to move, unable to scream. The whispers in the wind were always there, clawing at the edges of my consciousness, urging me to listen, to follow. I had become like my uncle. I had grown accustomed to the strange, oppressive atmosphere, to the isolation. The outside world had faded away. It was as though I had ceased to exist outside of this house, this land. My body had become frail, and my mind was slowly unraveling, piece by piece. The knocking was relentless. But there were other things, other changes I couldn't explain. At times, I could hear footsteps echoing through the hallways, as if someone were walking just out of sight. Sometimes, I'd wake up to find myself standing in the woods, miles away from the cottage, though I never remembered how I got there. I felt as though I was no longer in control, like something else was pulling me, guiding me to places I didn't understand. One night, as the knocking echoed louder than it ever had before, I decided to face it. I couldn't take the silence anymore. I could feel my sanity slipping away, piece by piece, and I knew that if I didn't do something soon, I might lose myself completely. The house had already taken so much from me, my peace, my sleep, my sense of reality. But I wasn't going to let it take my mind. With trembling hands, I forced myself out of bed. The knocking was deafening now, coming from every direction, like 1,000 fists hammering on the walls. It felt as if the house itself was trying to consume me. The cold air gripped my skin, and I could see my breath mist in front of me, though it was the middle of summer. The atmosphere inside the cottage was suffocating, thick with dread. I grabbed the flashlight, my only companion in the oppressive darkness, and made my way to the front door. It had been so long since I'd dared to go outside, to confront the force that had always felt like a dark entity watching from the edges of my mind. But tonight, I had no choice. I needed to find the source of the knocking. I needed to understand why this curse had taken hold of me. The door creaked open, and I stepped out into the cool night. The forest loomed before me like a dark sea of towering trees, their branches swaying in the wind. The knocking echoed louder, and I knew it was coming from deep within the woods. I began to walk, the flashlight beam cutting through the dense underbrush as I ventured farther from the cottage, my feet crunching on the forest floor. The trees seemed to close in on me, their shadows stretching unnaturally in the moonlight. The whispers were louder now, rising above the sound of the knocking, urging me onward. "Come closer," they said. "It's waiting for you." I felt myself drawn deeper into the woods, unable to resist the pull. The air grew colder, and I could hear the rustling of unseen things in the underbrush, moving just out of sight. I turned my head, half expecting to see the figure from the mirror, but the forest was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me. Then I saw it. In the distance, through the trees, there was a flicker of light, a soft, flickering glow. I approached cautiously, my heartbeat quickening in my chest. As I drew closer, I saw what it was, a small clearing, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, covered in moss and overgrown vines. The air around it felt thick, heavy with an ancient presence. It was the source of the knocking. I stepped closer, the ground beneath my feet soft and yielding, as though the earth itself was alive. The knocking had stopped, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "It's time," they urged. "The ritual must be completed." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. The cottage, the land, the knocking, this had all been part of some dark, forgotten ritual, a curse passed down through the generations. My uncle had known. He had been the last in a long line of people doomed to live out their days here, trapped by the land's twisted grip. And now, it was my turn. I stood frozen before the altar, my mind racing. The whisper seemed to grow more urgent, the light brighter, more intense. A figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, shadowed, its features obscured by a dark hood. But as it moved closer, I saw its face. It was my uncle. But he was not the man I had known. His face was gaunt and hollow, his eyes sunken and dark. He looked at me with an expression that was both familiar and alien, his lips curling into a grim smile. He opened his mouth, and I heard the sound of the knocking again. But this time, it was coming from him. "You've come," he said, his voice hollow, as though it was carried on the wind. "It's your turn now." I tried to speak, but no words came out. The air around me was thick, pressing in on me, suffocating me. My uncle's figure seemed to fade and shift, his form growing less human and more like a shadow, blending with the darkness around us. And then, before I could react, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I fell, not into a pit, but into a void, an endless expanse of darkness. The air was thick with the sounds of knocking, the whispers, the voices of those who had come before me. Faces appeared around me, people who had once lived in the cottage, their eyes wide with terror, trapped like me, bound to the land for eternity. I could feel their hands reaching out for me, trying to pull me down into the abyss. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The knocking echoed louder than ever, a maddening rhythm that seemed to beat in time with my own heart. And then, I understood. The knocking was not just a call, it was a warning. A warning that the land would never release its grip. Once the curse took hold, it was impossible to escape. There was no way out. The faces around me began to fade, replaced by a new one, a figure cloaked in shadow. It raised its hand, and I felt my body being pulled toward it. I was no longer in control. The ritual had begun. And then, with a final, deafening knock, everything went silent. The darkness swallowed me whole. Days, or maybe weeks, later, I awoke in the cottage once more. The air was heavy, still, as though nothing had changed. The knocking had stopped, but the whispers remained, a constant presence in the back of my mind. I looked around, but everything seemed the same. The cottage, the forest, the altar in the clearing, they were all still there. And yet, I felt different. I felt older, weary, as though the curse had seeped into my very bones. I looked into the mirror, and what I saw sent a chill down my spine. It was my face, but it wasn't me anymore. My eyes were hollow, my skin pale. I was a part of the land now, just another lost soul trapped in this never-ending cycle. The knocking had stopped, but it would never be truly gone. It would return, calling for the next victim, just as it had called for me. And the land would claim them, as it had claimed so many before. I wasn't the last heir of my uncle's cottage. I was merely the next in line. And the curse would continue, until the end of time.